At 34 years old, I thought I had built a stable life. My wife, Linda, and I had been married for 5 years. She was a homemaker, and I traveled often for work, trusting her completely. Trust is funny like that. You don't realize how fragile it is until it shatters. One Sunday evening, during a work trip, I decided to surprise Linda by coming home early. I imagined her delight when I walked through the door. Instead, as I was driving, my phone buzzed with a message from her, a message that changed everything. Linda's text wasn't for me. It was meant for someone else. She wrote about how much she enjoyed the week, how she'd miss waking up next to someone else, and how she'd loved having sex every day. The words were unmistakable. My hands trembled as I pulled into a parking lot to reread the message, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. Anger and disbelief surged through me. I responded with a simple, "Get a lawyer," then threw my phone on the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way home. The shock didn't wear off as I arrived. Instead, it intensified when I walked through the door and overheard Linda on the phone with a man. "Honey, I'm home," I said, my voice cold. She froze, dropping her phone. What followed was a chaotic unraveling of our life together. Linda's face turned pale as I stepped into the house, casually asking if she was on the phone with the lawyer. Her stammering denials didn't faze me. Ignoring her protests, I went straight to the bedroom, ripped the sheets off the bed, and stuffed them into black plastic bags. These were likely the same sheets that bore evidence of her betrayal, and I wasn't leaving them behind. Linda trailed me, sobbing and insisting it was all a joke. I refused to engage. The pain of her actions made it impossible to consider anything other than ending this marriage. After packing the linens, I returned to the living room and gave her one chance to confess. I warned her I would send the sheets for testing if she lied. It was Richard. The name hit me like a slap. Richard wasn't just anyone, he was my friend. Betrayal from 2 directions at once left me speechless. The room was heavy with silence until I told Linda she couldn't stay in my house anymore. This home wasn't ours, it belonged to my family. My parents had passed it to me when they moved to a condo, and while Linda had lived here, she had no rights to the property. I called my dad to explain the situation, and he supported me fully. He even messaged Linda to make it clear she needed to leave. Linda begged and pleaded, but I stood firm. I told her to pack her things and stay with her parents. When she couldn't find her car keys, she realized I'd taken them from her purse. Both cars were in my name, as were the payments. She didn't argue for long when I pointed out that she hadn't bothered with any of the paperwork when we bought them. With no car, no phone, also mine, and no way to dig her heels in, Linda had no choice but to leave. I stood at the door until her parents arrived to pick her up. Her father's face turned pale when I showed him the incriminating text. He didn't try to defend her. After they left, the house was quieter than it had ever been. I should have felt relief, but instead, I was numb. Every memory of my life with Linda felt tainted. The laughter we'd shared, the dreams we had built, all of it felt like a cruel lie. In the following weeks, the divorce process began. Thanks to the prenup I insisted on before our marriage, things went smoothly. Linda wasn't entitled to any spousal support or access to my retirement accounts. We split our bank savings evenly, and she kept the minimal debt she'd accrued on her credit cards. I let her take some furniture and her personal belongings, but that was it. The process was mercifully quick, 6 months, most of which was just the mandatory waiting period. Linda tried to speak to me during mediation, but I shut her down every time. There was no point. Her betrayal wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, it was a full-blown affair. After the divorce was finalized, I found myself wrestling with unresolved anger. Linda's betrayal had been devastating, but Richard's involvement stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just some stranger, he was my friend, someone I trusted. That betrayal had simmered quietly in the background while I focused on the legal process, but once everything was settled, it refused to stay buried. I couldn't shake the thoughts of what he had done. It felt as though the wound he caused was deeper, cutting into my sense of judgment and self-worth. For months, I played out scenarios in my mind, imagining what I'd say or do if I ever confronted him. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. When I finally decided to face him, it wasn't an impulsive act. It was something I had thought about for too long, and the moment felt inevitable. I drove to his house and knocked on his door, heart pounding in my chest. As soon as I saw him, the floodgates opened. The anger I had been holding back exploded. Without hesitation, I let it out in the only way that made sense at that moment. My fists met their target, each strike fueled by months of pent-up rage, heartbreak, and humiliation. The tears came, unbidden, as I hit him again and again. By the time I stopped, he was on the ground, barely moving. My hands shook as I stood there, staring at what I had done. The weight of my actions hit me like a second wave, this time filled with exhaustion and regret, not for him, but for the part of myself that I had lost in the process. I called 911 and reported the incident. I knew I had crossed a line, but I didn't care. The paramedics arrived quickly, taking him to the hospital, and I was escorted to the police station. Sitting in that cold, quiet cell, I had time to reflect on everything that had led to this moment. There was no pride in what I had done, but there was also no regret. The confrontation felt like closure in a way that words alone could never have provided. When I was released later that evening, I learned that Richard hadn't pressed charges. He must have decided that it wasn't worth pursuing. The next day, I received a simple text message from him. It didn't apologize or explain, it simply stated that we were even. I deleted it without replying. As the dust settled, I realized the confrontation hadn't brought peace. It hadn't undone the betrayal or repaired what had been broken. But it had marked the end of a chapter. There were no more loose ends, no more unspoken words. The past was finally behind me, even if the scars it left would take much longer to heal. In the weeks after my confrontation with Richard, life began to settle into a strange new rhythm. The silence in my house, once shared with Linda, felt oppressive at first, but over time it became a kind of solace. The space was mine again, untainted by her betrayal. Though the anger had subsided, the pain lingered. Betrayal isn't something you recover from overnight. It seeps into your thoughts when you least expect it, forcing you to relive moments you wish you could forget. But little by little, I began to heal. The divorce, though painful, had been straightforward thanks to the prenup. There was no drawn-out battle over money or property, no children caught in the crossfire. In some ways, I was grateful for the simplicity of it all. It allowed me to focus on moving forward rather than being stuck in endless disputes. What I didn't expect was how much I would reflect on myself in the aftermath. 2 marriages ending in betrayal made me question my judgment, my trust in others, and even my worth. I realized I had been so focused on building relationships that I had neglected the relationship I had with myself. Over time, I found ways to rebuild. I threw myself into work, fitness, and hobbies I had abandoned during my marriage. I reconnected with friends and family, leaning on them for support when the loneliness crept in. Each day felt like a small step forward, even if some days were harder than others. As for Linda and Richard, they became relics of my past, painful reminders of what I had endured but also of what I had survived. I didn't dwell on what became of them. They no longer had any power over my life. Moving forward, I carried lessons from this experience. Trust is valuable but fragile, and it must be earned and protected. Self-respect is non-negotiable. And perhaps most importantly, it's better to be alone than to be with someone who doesn't value or respect you. Though this chapter of my life ended in heartbreak, I see it now as a beginning. It was the end of one story but the start of another, a story in which I am stronger, wiser, and more resilient. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. If this story resonated with you or helped in any way, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. There's life after betrayal, and sometimes, it's better than anything you imagined.